is Joe Pardavila. Thanks again for checking out the latest episode of the Forbes Books podcast. And one of the perks of my job is having the opportunity to meet and chat with some of my favorite writers. And today I'm fortunate enough to spend some time with Max Chafkin, the author of the brand new book, The Contrarian, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power. Max is a longtime tech reporter who works at Bloomberg Businessweek. His stuff has also appeared in the likes of Fast Company, Vanity Fair, and the New York Times Magazine. But now he's written hands down my favorite book of 2021. Max, thanks for stopping by.
Thanks for having me.
You are very welcome. And so, like most non-tech people, Peter Thiel didn't enter my consciousness until 2016 when the whole Gawker scandal happened and his support of Donald Trump. But do you remember the first time you heard the name Peter Thiel or when you first became aware of him?
Yeah. So like you said, I mean, I'm a tech journalist. I work at Bloomberg Businessweek as an editor and have covered Silicon Valley for basically the past 16 years. And Thiel, has been a major figure in tech really for that entire period of time. The first time I think I heard his name was I was doing a story about a company called SpaceX, which everyone knows what that is now.
Yes.
But at the time, there was this guy, Elon Musk, who had started a well-known company at the time, PayPal, and this is like in the mid-2000s. And he had this crazy idea that he was going to start a rocket company. And it was even crazier because he was also starting an electric car company. And, and he was friendly with this fellow Peter Thiel because they had been co-founders at PayPal. And Thiel went on to invest in SpaceX. And I actually interviewed him back then for that story about Elon Musk. It was a very quick interview or whatever. But yeah, it was around Elon Musk. And but he was actually everywhere at the time. So because right back then, mid 2000s, that's when Facebook was taking off. 2004, this really unknown kind of problematic Harvard student who had gotten in trouble for doing something kind of vaguely hackery, comes to Silicon Valley with this plan to start a company, and who gives him his money? None other than Peter Thiel. Thiel is the person who basically establishes Mark Zuckerberg as Mark Zuckerberg and has been on the board ever since. So if you don't know Thiel, or if you only know him because of these, like the political stuff that you mentioned, or because of Gawker, or because he's kind of a sort of figure, a controversial figure, he's also just been this incredibly influential figure in business, and really one of the guys who I think you could credit with creating Silicon Valley as it exists today. I mean, there are other people you could definitely say this about, but the argument is strong with Thiel because you've got co-founded PayPal. PayPal is the company that really, makes digital payments, virtual currency a thing. Obviously, that's a big deal right now with Bitcoin and crypto and stuff. And many of those ideas were really embedded in the original PayPal, something they don't totally get credit for, but I think they should. He was this incredibly successful venture capitalist, as I said, Facebook, SpaceX. And he also weirdly had this period in the late 90s as a very successful hedge fund manager. So yeah, he was a very successful business figure before he kind of came onto the political scene.
Got it. And let's dig into the book a little bit. Most introductions to books are very basic, as you know. They're almost like a quick little preamble, and authors don't like to give away too much. But I have to say, the introduction to The Contrarian is one of the best I've ever read because it paints such a vivid picture of Thiel. Was that important for you to set the tone right out of the box?
Yeah, definitely. One thing about Thiel that's kind of interesting, he is a very cerebral guy who has allowed, very little of his personal life or really frankly, like his humanity to show through. And he's private and that's, whatever. People have all sorts of different appetites for that sort of thing. But, it was really important for me that, first of all, that I would understand him as a human being and that readers be able to see that. So yes, in the intro, I definitely wanted to do that. And the other thing in the intro, and I'll give you kind of a little taste anyway, is it's basically about this meeting that happened in 2016 when Thiel brought a bunch of high profile conservatives to meet with Mark Zuckerberg. And this was a time when Facebook was sort of struggling in that department. Thiel kind of brings them in, brings Facebook closer to kind of what you might think of as like the establishment right. And kind of Trump campaign and Trump supporters were off to the races from that point. Trump was very, very successful on Facebook. Facebook, I think, had a huge impact on the election. So it was a really important moment, but it's also a moment seeing this guy, this behind the scenes player, which is what Thiel really is, doing something that had a big kind of public impact as well.
And you said you want to make him sound like a human, but I will say, in all honesty, there are parts of the book where he just doesn't seem like a real person. Like he has this sort of Voldemort-type presence where he's lurking in the shadows, scheming to get his revenge against Harry Potter. How hard was it to write about Peter Thiel and still make it seem like this person is real? Because he is a dynamic individual, and unless you were to meet or read up on Peter Thiel, you would think nah, this is just like a character from literature or something.
Right. I mean, of course, that's what makes him so compelling, and that's what makes some of these other guys, and I definitely put him in the same category as somebody like Elon Musk, where they're just he's got his finger in a lot of different things. He's sort of a bundle of contradictions, and as you said, he's scheming. And one thing about Thiel that I find interesting is that if you follow the tech industry for the last couple of decades, as I have, it's a very idealistic business, right? Like tech CEOs, they tend to talk about, we want to change the world. We want to make the world a better place. And I think some of that is real, right? And some of that is kind of fake, right? They're just saying that because it sounds good for marketing or something. One thing that's kind of refreshing about Thiel is that he doesn't quite pretend to that specific effect, right? He is more explicitly interested in power. And I think that all of these companies are really interested in power. They're just kind of not honest enough to say so. So that's something that's made him appealing to me as a subject, right? It's a way to talk about tech power directly without having to, kind of be indirect and to cut through the BS. I mean, there's sort of not a lot of mistaking what Thiel wants, even though, yes, he is kind of secretive. Yes, he is a behind the scenes player, but this is somebody who wants money and he wants influence, and he's willing to do all sorts of things to get that. Some of which I think push the bounds of what normal people think is acceptable in business.
On that note, a friend of mine who's very involved in tech has sold multiple businesses out in the Valley. I told him that I was going to talk to you about Peter Thiel, and he just wrote back. Let me just read it. I'm going to quote the text back. He goes, "The guy is evil." So that's someone in the know in Silicon Valley. That forward text back I get, the guy is evil. So I mean, obviously, not everyone is just 100% evil, but was it hard for you to sort of kind of show the soft side of Peter Thiel? And the reason I ask this is because I know you interviewed a lot of people in the Thielverse, as you talk about in the book, but did they make him sound like he was like a regular person that you could sit around and have a beer with?
No.
Okay.
I definitely talked to some people who've, had drinks with Thiel. It's definitely possible.
He has actually consumed liquids.
But I do, yeah, exactly. But I do think he, relates to the world and relates to other people in a kind of, in a way that's different and that makes people uncomfortable. And I think there are definitely, arguments to support your friend's point of view. And there are definitely lots of people in tech and outside of tech who really see him as this kind of supervillain. People who admire him, I think they sort of take for granted some of the things that really rub people the wrong way. So he is somebody who treats life like it's a board game, right? He's sort of Machiavellian. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of us, that is not necessarily a quality you want in a friend, but somebody who's sort of, sees other people as chess pieces that they can move around the board. On the other hand, I think some other people sort of accept it and they just say, well, this is kind of how he is. And it's like how anyone accepts anyone else. And, right. and it's like when, and I do think the other thing that probably his defenders would bring up is some of the stories in the book that really have rubbed some tech people the wrong way, one of which I'll just give you a taste is during the PayPal years, Thiel was very kind of pushy in advocating for himself. I mean, that's actually like a ridiculous understatement.
Right.
There was a coup. So Musk was the CEO of PayPal. The employees led a coup that deposed him. And it was when Musk was, on his honeymoon.
I was going to say, wasn't he on vacation during while
yeah,
that
it
was
was
all
a
going on?
pretty harsh. And then after Thiel pushed the board into board of directors, which included, Mike Moritz, who's one of the most famous, respected venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, pushed him into putting Thiel on the board, and then, very aggressively, and this is described in the book, kind of forced the board to give him a bunch more money, basically on pain of, I will leave the company. And at that point in a startup, if the founder leaves a company, like that's it, the company dies. So it's sort of like either you're going to pay me or you're going to lose everything. It's kind of a super hardball tactic, not the kind of thing you associate with kind of Silicon Valley. So that's just like one example. It's also kind of removed from politics, which is why I wanted to bring it up. And that's the kind of thing that people point to and say, wow, that's harsh. That's not something that a person who is an ethical businessman does. The counter argument, of course, is that venture capitalists are not necessarily the most kind-hearted and,
Yeah, it's not rainbow
Right,
unicorns.
right, exactly. I mean, there is something. There have been a lot of stories, of course, about founders getting pushed around by their boards, and I think if you talk to people in Silicon Valley, even people who don't like Thiel, they would say, that at that time there was kind of an imbalance of power, and maybe Thiel was right to be advocating for himself, and maybe he was right to be pushing even that hard, even that ruthlessly. So I think it's hard to say, but it's definitely a sort of different standard of behavior that he has applied to himself, and it's kind of like take it or leave it.
And after reading the book, I still don't have a clear understanding of the relationship between Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, who we were just talking about. What's the current state of their relationship now?
I would say they're frenemies, maybe would be a way to put it. They're allies, although I don't think they're super close.
Okay.
Obviously, they have certain shared interests. Thiel, I think, gets credit, probably justifiably, for helping to save SpaceX. SpaceX had several launch failures. Thiel kind of made a big investment in that company, Elon Musk's company, at a time when it's not entirely clear that Musk would have been able to find the capital elsewhere. I mean, I think he would probably say that he could have, but again, Thiel played a big role in SpaceX, and so they obviously have some shared interests and definitely friends in common, but they are very different people. And Musk is obviously brainy, but he's not this kind of cerebral chess master. And there's a quote to that effect in the book. He is much more like I'm gonna bet on myself and I'm gonna bet big and win or lose. He's this sort of like deep feeling entrepreneur, and Thiel is a bit more of a cold fish. He's kind of a cerebral investor who doesn't necessarily get as caught up in any one company. The other thing is, Musk is a hardcore, and this comes up in the book, Musk is a hardcore environmentalist. He started this electric car company, removing the carbon footprint of humanity is a huge priority for him. And Thiel is on the other side of that debate. He is a climate change skeptic, and he is friendly with and has advocated for, these academics who, most people on the other side of would see as basically, cranks.
The fringe.
Yeah, fringy climate deniers. So that's a pretty big difference as well.
And speaking of relationships, I love the way you paint the Thiel and Mark Zuckerberg dynamic in the book. Again, to borrow like a pop culture thing, it's very much like a Yoda and Luke Skywalker thing. And I found it especially funny that Peter would actually be a richer man had he invested more money into Facebook, which is just bizarre to even think about. Talk to me about those two and their dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, this is I think one of the most interesting kind of human stories in Silicon Valley, and it's just something that's totally underexplored. I've got a bunch of it in the book. I think there's probably still tons more to talk about. There's that scene in the Social Network, which you've probably seen, where they meet. Zuckerberg and who's played by Jesse Eisenberg, and Sean Parker, played by Justin Timberlake, go into this kind of lame-looking office, and there's this like lame-looking suit who invests in the company and says, "Oh, you got to fire your founder," and that's Thiel. And their relationship, I think, is, again, it's a little, I would say, it's not totally dissimilar from Musk in terms of there's a shared interest and things like that. But I think it's pretty clear that Thiel has had a huge impact on Zuckerberg, not just on Zuckerberg's trajectory as a businessman. He's, protected Zuckerberg, made sure that he is the decision maker at Facebook, but also in terms of like Zuckerberg's ideology. And, Zuckerberg at times has sounded a bit like a sort of centrist, liberal or something like that. He gave money to charter schools, Cory Booker,
Right.
The Chan Zuckerberg Foundation is sort of a feels kind of center lefty. Zuckerberg is pro-immigration, but in 2019, Zuckerberg goes to Georgetown and gives this speech about misinformation and takes this really pretty strong stand saying that, I am not going to censor if Donald Trump or Donald Trump's campaign buys ads that lie, that say that, that show Nancy Pelosi in a doctored video or whatever.
Right.
I'm not going to change that. And that's not my job, and I don't want to do it. And that was, number one, that is the position that the Trump campaign wanted. But it's also, an ideological position. And it's an ideological position that I think clearly stems from Thiel's, libertarianism. He's a hardcore libertarian and also, frankly, like a hardcore Trump supporter. And I think you saw the influence there.
Yeah. And I know you kind of went into it in the book. And why didn't Thiel invest more money into Facebook? It just seems weird because you're painting this picture of like he's in his corner, sort of guiding him through all this. Yet he could probably be, again, it's kind of bizarre to think he'd be richer than he already is because it's hard to add another zero to the number of zeros to his bank account. But why do you think he didn't invest more into the company?
So Thiel, this gets back to what I was sort of saying about Elon Musk. Elon Musk kind of like think of him as an entrepreneur in the sort of Steve Jobs mold, right?
Yeah.
Like I am going to bet on myself. Anybody who disagrees with me is the enemy. I'm going to just, I'm crazy and I'm going to
all that stuff.
Yeah, all that stuff. Thiel is, I think, more of the investor, more of the, like, even though he was an entrepreneur, even though he co-founded a company that Musk co-founded, he is, I think at his core, an investor, a hedge fund guy. He ran a huge hedge fund, and he thinks of these companies like assets, not like, oh, I want to bet my life on this. And so you see this pattern actually over and over again in his career. He makes these really bold early bets, and then pretty quickly will often move to de-risk, to find ways to avoid whatever, to avoid overexposure. So with Facebook, the Facebook story, big part of it, which you probably heard this before, is Mark Zuckerberg was offered $1 billion from Yahoo in, I think it was 2007, and he said no, famously, and that was and he was off to the races. Thiel, along with the rest of the board of the directors, my reporting suggests, wanted him to sell. He didn't want Mark Zuckerberg to bet on Mark Zuckerberg. He wanted him, cash out and, get me a nice return, which I think was understandable, right? It wasn't totally clear where Facebook was going. And, the same thing played out after Facebook went public. Thiel got out of the company almost immediately. So, like you say, that investment was a huge return, $500,000. I think it ended up being worth more than $1 billion. Just incredibly prescient. But man, if he'd held on, it would, I've actually done the math. I just don't know it off the top of my head, but it would be, in the tens of billions of dollars, I think at least. So
do you think the way you describe it, Max, is it's almost like, when you go to your 401k guy or IRA guy, there was like diversify your funds. Like he takes that approach with all his business. He's like, I just want a little piece of this, a little piece of that. I don't want to put too much of my eggs in one basket.
Yes, 100%. And you can see that in his investment activity. So that's kind of he's always got, a source told me, he has this sort of two portfolios. He has this kind of optimistic portfolio, which is the startup portfolio. And then he has a pessimistic portfolio, which is the hedge fund piece, which is like where he shorted the U.S. economy in 2008, making another very prescient call. And so, so he's always doing these couple of different things, which is another reason why, not necessarily the most popular fellow in Silicon Valley, despite the fact that he has had all this influence. One other thing, though, as much as he has not profited entirely from the Facebook thing, right? He could be much richer if he had held on. He has held on to his board seat, and that board seat has been incredibly useful. It's really, I'd say it's useful to both Zuckerberg and Thiel, but Thiel has certainly used that board seat to, acquire further influence. Like that meeting I described where he's in the room with Zuckerberg and 20 of these prominent conservatives, Thiel doesn't get access to those people if he isn't the conservative board member on Facebook. And there's kind of a weird dynamic now with Mark Zuckerberg and Thiel, because Thiel now he doesn't own very much Facebook stock, barely any at all. But, promoting all these candidates who are dumping on Facebook basically every day. This guy, J.D. Vance, who's running for Senate in Ohio's former employee of Thiel, is, knocking Facebook every day. In some ways, Thiel is creating distance. On the other hand, Mark Zuckerberg needs Peter Thiel on that board, because without Thiel, he has no kind of conservative cred at all. And all these attacks are going to get so much worse. So you kind of feel like they have this, at this point, it's basically a friendship of convenience or something.
Yeah. And you write about how Peter can be cold to friends, colleagues, political figures, even his companies. But can you please explain his obsession with Palantir? He seems to hold that company up to a different level to the other companies he's been involved with. I know a big chunk of the second half of the book, you delve into that. But and that's the one thing, and one of the reasons I want to on the podcast is like, what is up with him and that company? It's like this. He has like this man crush on it, and he just can't let go.
Well, I mean, he is the founder of Palantir. I mean, Palantir is, very much Peter Thiel's idea. It was taking the technology that PayPal had developed to deal with money laundering and marketing it very aggressively to the U.S. military in the wake of September 11th. And there's sort of the history is really, up and down. And I think people have criticized Palantir in all sorts of different directions. Some people say it's too big brothery, right? It's a surveillance state thing. And there's some truth to that. And then there's another thread of criticism, which I explore quite a bit in the book, which is that the company's software, okay, maybe big brothery, but for a long time it didn't really work. And so
he was still selling it for millions of dollars.
Yeah, where it's this like it's more of a marketing project than anything else. And so that's another piece of it. But what you gotta say, hats off. I mean, the company managed to, I think, through Thiel's kind of basically his brilliance of political and business marketing, managed to sell a huge amount of software services to the U.S. government, particularly U.S. government that was run by this president, where he was the most prominent outside business supporter, and also has used Palantir's kind of cred as a government contractor to get all these corporate contracts. And I haven't checked the market cap lately, but the last time I looked, it was worth $40 billion. Wow. So and Thiel still owns. I haven't checked his holdings lately. He's been selling just as he always does. But at the time they went public, he owned like 15% of the company. He's still effectively the controlling shareholder, even though officially he's not. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely close to his heart or whatever.
Yeah, I found it funny, Max, because there were all these other amazing companies he was involved with, yet this is the one that he had the most activity with. The other ones, like you said, he just like buy and got the hell, he grew it for a little bit and he got rid of it. But this one, it's like he's holding it really close to him.
Well, that's also a function of the fact that his money was tied up in it. I mean, he was one of the main funders for years and years. And like, as I said, he had, a huge amount of stock, right? I'm not sure that him holding on to it was entirely his own choice. It may have been that no one, wanted to buy the stock, or at least not to buy the stock enough. And as I report in the book, there were attempts to sell Palantir. I think if the right offer had come along, right, he would have sold. It's just Palantir has been so up and down for so long that they really had no choice. And it's got, it's a credit to like I said, his strategic ability and the strategic ability of Alex Karp, who's the CEO of the company, that they were able to, kind of navigate a lot of craziness.
And I mentioned at the top how Thiel came to public prominence when he supported Trump and he spoke at the RNC convention. Was Palantir pretty much the only thing he got out of that relationship? Because that's what it seems like in the book. Like, all of the things he tried to do, again, his puppet master routines behind the scenes didn't exactly come to fruition as he had hoped, but he was able to get Palantir sort of on the map when it comes to those military contracts.
I think that's a fair assessment. I'll add a couple of things. So number one, I just want to put this in. Palantir, will deny up and down that political connections had anything to do with their rise over the last 4 years. Which, okay, I'm gonna put that out there.
I'll just laugh as you say, Max.
Okay, I mean, I'm skeptical of it, and I think it's pretty obvious why. But in any case, that's their point of view. Now, Palantir did very well, as I said, through the Trump administration, and that has made Thiel quite a bit richer during that period. his other efforts in the White House, I mean, at times they were almost like comically bad, right? Like where he's putting forward these people who are too extreme, as talk about in the book. Steve Bannon is his main ally. Bannon is not somebody who's known for being, a wilting flower or something. And these people are too extreme for Bannon. Bannon is like, I can't, so
I will say, Max, by the way, you were one of the few people that made Steve Bannon likable for a few pages. There were a couple things I'm like, wow, maybe the Steve Bannon's not 100% horrible.
So, but anyway, like I said, Bannon is even Bannon is skeptical of many of these folks, and Thiel's sort of track record in terms of if the scoreboard is how many people did he get in the White House, then it looks pretty bad.
Yeah.
But I think, and the way I see it is that maybe Thiel was playing another game, and that game has to do obviously with business, as I said, but also I think has to do with accumulating influence in the long run. When you look at what has happened post-Trump, he is not, you would sort of imagine, okay, the number one, the business person who was most closely associated with Trump, that this would probably really hurt him when Trump kind of, goes out in a blaze of infamy. He gets COVID and hundreds of thousands of people are dying, and there's January 6th happens, and he loses to this 78-year-old or 77-year-old two-time loser. So like not a really great end for the Trump presidency, and you would think a bad ending for anybody who had any association with Trump. But that hasn't happened to Thiel. What Thiel's kind of done very cleverly is allied himself with, what you might call like Trumpism, like this kind of base of support that Trump has. He's got these two Senate candidates that he's funding incredibly lavishly. He's giving them each $10 million. That's Blake Masters in Arizona, J.D. Vance in Ohio. And those guys are really extensions of Thiel. I mean, they both worked for him. Blake Masters still works for him. And they are very much, his school of thought, his belief system, interested in defending the things that he wants to defend, which often coincide with ways that will help optimize his, net worth. So I think he's actually in, kind of a good position in the sense that he is able to kind of claim the mantle of Trumpism without necessarily getting kind of burned for the stuff that Trump gets burned for. So we'll see. But I do think if you look at his influence, his political influence now compared to like 2015, it's a lot higher. Now, could he have done even better if he had been a little bit more savvy? I think almost certainly the case. And if he had been a little bit more savvy, he's very extreme and everything. And I think you could argue about whether having him being more influential than Trump and his administration would have been a good or bad thing for the country. But like, I think it probably would have been a good thing if he had been more successful at
completing his mission, really.
Yeah, but in fact, he may not have been trying that hard, as I said.
Right. You brought up something I'd like to bring up, and you always hear like these high impact entrepreneurs, CEOs, founders talk about, I don't want to be surrounded by yes men. I don't need that. But it almost seems like you have to drink the Kool-Aid completely when it comes to working with Peter Thiel and staying in the Thielverse, as opposed to being someone who's going to bring opposing views. Is that a correct assessment?
That is, yes, I would say that's 100% correct.
Okay.
And I think that's really interesting. There's a chapter in 0 to 1, which is Thiel's, kind of like self-help business book thing.
Right.
I think it's called like The Mechanics of Mafia. It's about the fact that Thiel's sort of network is known as the PayPal Mafia. And mafias, of course, are not known for being like, it's not like a team of rivals, right? In a mafia, it's all about loyalty. It's about power. It's about getting people who are your friends to do things for you, and keeping this kind of tight circle. And that's how Thiel's run things. And I think it is obviously a recipe for all sorts of bad stuff, as we can see with the history of mafias. Having a team of yes men tends to be not to be the most intellectually healthy thing. And I think you could probably some of the stuff that Thiel's involved with that people find really distasteful, I think you could point a direct line to having basically a lot of people who agree with him around him. On the other hand, I think that his story shows that, maybe these things that people tend to kind of denigrate or see as the realm of mafia, maybe those things are actually important. And like maybe you can build a really important business mafia. And we can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think it clearly is true in Thiel's case. he's adopted kind of like a contrarian, method to accruing power. And I have to say, like, a lot of people talk about wanting to hear a diversity of opinions, but they don't necessarily really believe that.
Right. With him, I don't feel like he's ever said that. He's about like, yes, you have to agree with me. And I wonder, have you ever spoken to the folks, because, obviously you can't get names, but people in this PayPal mafia that you referenced in the book and we're talking about now, are all of them authentically like 100% Thiel, or is it to them the same way, a means to the end, a means to their end?
It's all different things. And, when we talk about the PayPal mafia, we sometimes include people who are not necessarily the true believers. Musk is sometimes looped in.
Yeah.
He's a sort of a member of the PayPal mafia, but he's not like a Thiel loyalist in the same way. The YouTube guys, are not that close with Thiel at all, but they're often seen as members of the mafia. But I think it's a combo of things, like the original core of the mafia, and I think this is what makes it powerful when you talk to, kind of early PayPal people in this world, like they bring this up all the time, but the original core of PayPal were people who worked at Peter Thiel's, right-wing newspaper at Stanford. So they were people who really who drank the ideological Kool-Aid, and that ideological Kool-Aid, turned into kind of a business philosophy with PayPal around kind of this sort of libertarian digital currency thing. You do also have a phenomenon, and you can see this, playing out, on Twitter, and where if you want Peter Thiel's money, a good way to get it is to try on some of the things that he believes, and to try to flatter him or flatter people in his world, in an intellectual way.
Wow.
And
that's gross.
So that's where you see the, the influence, I think, most profoundly, because Thiel obviously has this mafia. He's, like I said, it's a handful of people. They're super loyal to him. They're often very rich. They can do big things together. But then there are these like kind of outer layers, and I think in the outer layers, that's one of the things he's been really smart about. He started this fellowship. We haven't talked about it, but giving young, promising techies $100,000 to effectively drop out of college. And the fellowship, it's not necessarily been the most successful thing. I mean, you could get into a debate with it. I think probably it's failed in a lot of ways. But one way it hasn't failed is it created this incredibly powerful kind of platform for Thiel and Thielism, where you not only have him and his inner circle, but you have this kind of like middle circle of kind of Thiel fellows who often have adopted some of his beliefs or all of his beliefs, some of his mannerisms. You spend enough time around a powerful person, you sort of start acting like them a little bit, I think. And then you have like the aspiring fellows, right, who also want to be part of this. And that's how, influence works. And Thiel has been incredibly smart about seeing that and deploying it. And I think that's something that when people talk about tech, right, they often, and the kind of success of Silicon Valley over the last 20 years, it's often a story about, sort of technological innovation and software code and things like that. But a lot of it has been kind of fought in the realm of marketing and ideas. And Peter Thiel, like for whatever you want to say about him as a technologist, like he is an amazing sort of personal marketer, right? Like if you thought about him as an influencer, wow, like what a successful
without the bathing
guy.
suit, he's like an influencer without like the bathing
Yeah,
suit
exactly.
shots.
Yeah, and I think that the same thing could be said about Musk. I think Musk is totally underrated as a marketer, and so like these guys have been incredibly sophisticated, and not necessarily with starting with wonderful skills, as you said. Thiel, I'm sure he looks fine in a bathing suit, but right, he's not like he's not the most personable guy. Yeah. He's not the best looking guy. I mean, he's a good looking man, but like whatever, he's not like an influencer, and yet he's been able to to put himself really at the center of what I would argue is the most important and influential industry in the world. So that's kind of an amazing story to me.
It's funny how way ahead of his time he was on pretty much everything, whether it comes to the PayPal, whether it's getting involved in Facebook so early on, but also his views. Like, it was funny for me, like I had to do a double check while I was reading your book, that all these like what are now considered extreme right-wing views, he was writing about it and talking about it in like 1991, 92. Yeah. So it's crazy to think that sort of theology was around then, but it was so below the surface. As a kid growing up in, the New York metropolitan area, you never heard about stuff like this unless someone, one of these people acted out and did something crazy. Like this extreme right-wing view, which is now pretty prevalent, it's been around for like 25, 30 years.
Yeah, and I think Thiel along with a handful of other people who were involved in that college movement in the 80s, they created it. And the alt-right, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It really grew out of, the work that people like Thiel, and including Thiel, were doing, at college newspapers, where they were, really poking at what they regarded as kind of like a certain liberal orthodoxy. But basically what they wanted was to be able to say stuff that liberals regard as racist or sexist. And that as a cause, like that's something that Trump really picked up on and was really successful with. Trump's big, one of his big source of appeal, I think, was like he was willing to say these kind of unsayable things. And that was like the cause of Peter Thiel's life. So when people talk about Thiel's support of Trump and they have trouble like understanding, like, why would somebody like Peter Thiel, a gay immigrant who's all about technology and competence, support this kind of crass, know nothing, anti-immigrant, this guy in Trump who just seems like everything, he seems like 180 degrees removed from everything Peter Thiel stands for, except this thing that I just brought up, which is this desire to be the guy who says the unsayable. That is, for whatever reason, incredibly important to Thiel and a lot of these far right figures, and I think it was something that Trump picked up on and ran with and got himself elected president with it.
When you were doing the research and going back to his Stanford days, and I don't want to go too deep into it because it's like a cesspool of like, but when you were reading it, were you like shocked that even existed on a college campus, especially Stanford, as we now know is sort of like this liberal bastion of education, that this existed back then? Was that a surprise to you?
I mean, I was surprised by a couple of things. So one is that you say that Stanford is a liberal bastion of liberal education, and it kind of is, but it's not as liberal as a lot of the other. I'd say it's actually one of the more conservative of the elite universities. Stanford, remember, is the Hoover Institution, which is this preeminent conservative think tank, is located at Stanford. Ronald Reagan, his administration was full of these of Stanford. Former Stanford professors, former Hoover fellows. The guy who invented Reaganomics came out of Stanford. It wasn't a place that was like, the most lefty campus in the world. So I think I was a little bit surprised, and I get into this in the book, like, what would lead somebody to feel persecuted at a place where the Hoover Institution, literally looms over the campus? The tallest building there is the Hoover Tower. You can see it from like almost anywhere on campus. So that, I think, is just interesting and weird. And I think it suggests maybe there was some calculation there, and he realized that playing the kind of aggrievement card would be a successful strategy, and it was. But I also think, like, going back and reading the Stanford Review, which is the newspaper he started. Yeah, it's just full of stuff that's incredibly out there. And there's this conspiracy theory, or I don't know if maybe calling it a conspiracy theory is the wrong way to put it. But a couple of student journalists at Stanford over the past couple of years have gone looking for these kind of missing Stanford Review issues. There are a couple of issues that are not in the archive, right? And so some people think, okay, like maybe it was like somebody pulled it out because it was something so embarrassing. Maybe Thiel wrote something that was so terrible that they had to secretly remove it. And the truth is, like, maybe, but if
They're
you
probably
look at
just
what's
lost, Max. I was gonna say, because all the stuff you did found was pretty scandalous.
Well, and that's what I was gonna say. Like, I just think, first of all, I think it's not true. I did some reporting, but also, like, you don't need to go looking for the missing issues to find stuff that would upset you today. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff, and now of course, whatever mores have changed since then and stuff, but it definitely is. You could read those old back issues alongside kind of posts by the alt-right in 2015 and 2016, and they are very much of a piece. It's kind of this flirting with stuff that's out and out racist or out and out sexist, and using that to kind of try to, if you're trying to sort of sympathize with them or something, using that to try to make some kind of political point. And another way to put this would be using it as kind of a troll.
Right.
And that's and like those ideologies, they have so much in common. I think that the alt-right owes a debt to Thiel and to that kind of work. I don't know if it's not necessarily I guess the proudest
Yeah,
distinction.
like a badge of honor.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, my last pop cultural reference here is the ending of the book to me was very reminiscent to the ending of Avengers Infinity War, after Thanos wipes out half the universe with a snap of his fingers, and he just retreats to some quiet farm out to live out the rest of his days. And without giving away too much about your ending of the book, that's sort of the vibe I got with Peter Thiel. Like, he's sort of, I want to say retired, but he's sort of just like living out in the Wild West somewhere, and sort of like enjoying his work.
I think it'd be a mistake to see him as like completely out of the game. I think,
Yeah.
Thiel is influential, powerful, dangerous to some people's point of view, and it'd be a mistake to sort of write him off, especially given what he's doing politically. But you're right. I mean, he's definitely entered this, or maybe he just briefly entered this stage of his career. He's had a couple of children, as I, report in the book, and he's, but a parent of young children, that obviously changes things. But also, it was kind of a convenient time to withdraw. As I said, Trump was kind of self-immolating, like, every day on national television. And if you're interested in preserving your long-term influence and you are a prominent Trump supporter, a good strategy is probably to remove yourself. And I think that's exactly what he did. So I don't think he's out of the game. I think he's going to be certainly a major player, in 2022, 2024. And, he's going to be a player in tech too. There's some stuff going on. He's been involved with a couple SPACs. He's got some crypto stuff going on. I think there's going to be, there will be a continued steady drumbeat of sort of Thiel connected investments that will continue to make waves. And I expect that, he will be, one of the kingmakers on the right, which is why I think this book exists and why people should read it. Because I think, we really got to understand this man's, background and ideology and where he comes from, what he's thinking, because he is definitely playing a big role in shaping our society and our culture.
And on a couple personal notes, when you were writing the book, doing the research, were you worried about any repercussions? Because obviously he's very powerful, and you paint the picture right on page one. But was there anything that you were like, or maybe even like your wife said, "Are you sure you should be writing this thing? Don't you got something better to do?"
Well, I'd be silly or stupid or something if I didn't have those thoughts, because, he, as you said at the top of this conversation, one of the things he's famous for is destroying a media outlet who wrote things that he disagreed with and that he was offended by, and that he felt violated his privacy. And he didn't do it in a direct way. He didn't sue them for defamation or libel or invasion of privacy. He did it in this kind of, very indirect way, finding a different lawsuit and doing it in secret and rendering a, $100 million judgment that left the outlet destroyed, many of the journalists out of work, and the founder of the outlet, personally bankrupt. So yeah, I mean, you have to think about that stuff. That said, I did not set out to write a book that was salacious, and I don't think I've produced that. And so again, I don't think journalists who write things that are quote unquote salacious deserve to have their livelihoods taken away either. But that was one factor. And the other factor, which is just that I think that Peter Thiel is a really powerful dude who needs to be understood, and who needs to have, critical journalism about him. And for that journalism to succeed, it needs to be fearless, or it's going to be worthless. So I just decided to not be afraid, I guess. Yeah. And hopefully, that doesn't, come back to bite me. Yes, powerful people are going to do stuff that to intimidate journalists. They always have, and they always will. And I think, we as journalists just have a duty to ourselves and to our readers to not care. and even when not caring is a little bit scary and painful.
And, you mentioned, I think, if I remember correctly, didn't you have like a one-on-one meeting that was like for 5 minutes with him or something like that? He just talked and got up?
No, we had I was in touch with, various representatives of Thiel, direct representatives of Thiel, trying to secure his cooperation. I wanted this book to be basically journalistic. So I wanted to talk to critics, and I wanted to talk to the man himself, and I wanted to kind of get beyond the kind of the easy narratives. And I think I've still done that. But yeah, I had a meeting with him. The meeting was off the record. It lasted a little over an hour. And again, he got up and left.
Hold on, Max. You talk about that in the book. Was there a segue word like, I'll be right back, or give me a minute or something like that? Or did he just literally get up in the middle,
I'm just going to defer to what's in the book.
Okay.
But you know, as I said, it was a strange, bit of a strange meeting. You know, I thought it was unfortunate that he didn't want to be interviewed, on the record. You know, I had met with him a couple times before. I met with him in person one other time and talked to him before on another occasion. So I had talked to him, whatever, on the record before, but yeah, we just had that one meeting, and as you said, it ended very abruptly. But of course, it was good to see him in person. I mean, the thing about Thiel is, although he's in some ways, this kind of like secretive, scheming fellow, he has left this incredibly, voluminous track record of his thoughts and of his ideas and stuff like that. And I spent a huge amount of time reading his speeches, reading essays he's written, and, going back all the way to the editor's letters of the Stanford Review. And I think you can really, obviously a portrait emerges. And I'm not sure, to be honest, how much different that portrait would have been with, even if he had sat for the on the record interview. So yeah.
All right, let's get into a couple of tech things before I let you go. First, billionaires in space. Obviously, a lot of people have weighed in on this, on all, the Bransons and the Bezos launching themselves up into space. What do folks in Silicon Valley think of that whole thing?
Yeah, so I think in Silicon Valley, there are kind of 2 points of view. So one point of view is kind of admiration, I guess. These Silicon Valley is, has for years and years been really successful at churning out kind of software and stuff involving bits, and these rocket companies, are doing something in the real world, and something that's, obviously not easy. That said, I think people would draw a distinction maybe between what Musk's company is doing and what Branson and Bezos have done so far, which is like Musk's company, what they've been doing, just shuttling astronauts to the International Space Station, is on like a completely different scale in terms of degree of difficulty to what Branson and Bezos are doing, which is, do these really short suborbital flights.
Yeah. Space tourism, basically.
Space tourism. Yeah. And I think the critique would be, which is one I would kind of share, is that so far, all we're seeing really from Bezos and Branson is marketing. And it's really cool marketing. It may turn into something big. I think for Blue Origin, especially, that company wants to compete with SpaceX, and maybe this will help them get some more government contracts and be more of a legitimate competitor. But right now, I think when you look at the kind of, the galaxy, forgive the metaphor, but the galaxy of these space entrepreneurs, you've got Elon on one level and really everybody else, including Bezos, significantly behind. It's not even close right now.
And, this has become obviously a talking point for a lot of people, and it's cybersecurity. Over the past summer and even over the past year, we've had several ransomware attacks, and even John Oliver did a whole episode of Last Week Tonight in August about it. What is Silicon Valley doing to sort of future-proof us from these kind of events from happening?
I mean, I would argue nothing or not enough. Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing. I make this category a little bit broader beyond ransomware. But, in terms of cyber attacks, in terms of violations of privacy, we're seeing, basically just a continued, failure by the big tech companies to combat this stuff. And, we've seen it over and over again, particularly with Facebook. I mean, Facebook has had, one breach after another, and, they instead of like trying to do anything about it, they'll basically sort of parse the description. They'll say, well, it wasn't a breach. It was it was a leak or something. And so I think unfortunately, and this is actually connects back to Thiel, I think, there is this ethos in the tech industry, which is, you don't really worry about regulation, right? You don't worry about, you sort of just try to build a big business, and you break a few things along the way. The Facebook motto here is move fast and break things. And I think that owes a debt certainly to Zuckerberg's, one of Zuckerberg's mentors, Thiel. And it's something that has really kind of spread throughout Silicon Valley, where these tech companies just have decided like the sort of externalities, that the bad stuff that we enable or that we cause, just doesn't matter because we're trying to grow big quickly. And I think that kind of made sense when the industry was in this kind of insurgent phase, say in the late 90s, early 2000s, when tech companies were small, when the impact of the tech industry was pretty minimal, when you didn't necessarily have all of your life's work and your friendships and your relationships and every photo of yourself ever, on these platforms. But now we do. And I think the ideology has not caught up. They're still living in that kind of, Mark Zuckerberg, Peter Thiel, who cares world. And I think it's bad. I think it's something that the industry is starting to reckon with. And certainly members of both political parties are starting to reckon with it, but I don't think it's fully happened. And I think people, increasingly don't trust a lot of these big tech companies to safeguard their data, and I think they're basically right not to trust them. I wish I had a happier thing to share, but I don't think our data is totally safe.
And lastly, speaking of books, the Ron Chernow book a few years ago called Titan, about the life of John D. Rockefeller, talked about breaking up big oil. And I see a lot of similarities in now 2021, maybe even 2022, about the possibility of breaking up these huge tech companies, namely the Amazons of the world. What do you see as from your years of tech reporting? I mean, you've never seen anything like it, obviously. What are the chances of the government stepping in and trying to break up one of these companies?
Well, I think that Biden has been much more aggressive than even kind of like the people who are advocating for antitrust reform, expected. He's the people who he's appointing to government are the kind of those who have been beating the drum most about the tech industry, including like Lena Khan, who's at the FTC now. So I think there's some prospect of some kind of significant antitrust action. The question is, what exactly would they do and how would that change things? I mean, Microsoft obviously, famously got hit with a huge, settlement in the 90s, and Microsoft, I don't know, I haven't checked the market cap lately, but I think it's worth over $1 trillion.
Yeah, they're doing okay.
Maybe approaching $2 trillion. It's one of the most valuable companies in the world. So, and I think, and some people argue that, even if, say, like Facebook got broke up or something, it wouldn't necessarily hurt Mark Zuckerberg or any of these companies. I think one thing that tells you that the wind is changing, though, and I'll bring it back to Thiel for 1 second. I mean, Thiel wrote a book, as I said, 0 to 1, where he talks about how great monopolies are and how you should you should cultivate a monopoly. And Thiel has, over the last couple of years, very gingerly stepped away from that direction. And he is now very much skeptical of big tech. Some of these tech companies have gone too far, and he's been sort of trying to aim things more at Google, right? Rather than Facebook, where he sits on the board. But he's definitely kind of changed sides, and he's supporting candidates that are advocating for, whatever, for regulation, harsher regulation against big tech companies, including Vance and Masters, but also Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz. So I think, if Thiel is this kind of brilliant futurist and he's sort of betting on some kind of further crackdown, I think we should do well to pay attention to that, especially given that he's the guy who wrote the book about how great, basically big tech is.
Right. And for folks who want to find out about the Rockefeller monopoly, it actually turned out good once he ended up being a richer man when they did break up big oil. So needless to say, like you said, it may actually do absolutely nothing. Just it'd be more of a sort of a cosmetic thing than anything else.
Yeah, and I think it would take some kind of, incredible achievement of government to really take these tech titans down a peg. I mean, they are in a position of incredible power, and it's very hard to see, it's hard to see that power changing anytime soon, frankly.
Yeah. Well, Max, this has been a real pleasure. Like I said, I'm a big fan of your book and would recommend it to anyone interested in the tech industry. Thanks again for hanging out with me today.
Thank you, Joe. It really a pleasure talking.
His name is Max Chafkin, and his book, The Contrarian, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power, is available now wherever books are sold. And that is it for this edition of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoy the show, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you automatically get new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I would love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please, don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.
This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio. Find out more at ForbesBooksRadio.com.